Good afternoon, Jalen. Yes, I'm Keith. I'm Professor Keith Clark. I teach in the English department, and also I'm affiliated with African American Studies here at George Mason, and I've been here since 1993. And so I've been here a minute, and I teach courses in literature, introductory literature courses, but primarily courses in African American literature on the undergraduate and graduate level. So it's great to be here with you.
Awesome. It's a pleasure to have you. And so you've authored many books on several prolific authors, including James Baldwin, Ernest J. Gaines, August Wilson, and Ann Petrie. So can you tell us a little bit about what inspired your academic interest in these authors or the impact their work has had on your own life?
Sure, that's a great question. Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate, gosh, it's been a minute, back in the early '80s at William and Mary, and majoring in English was not on my list of possibilities. I thought I'd be a business major, but at William and Mary they make you take accounting first to weed out people like me who are who can barely count. So my interest in literature just kind of blossomed as an undergraduate, and I was especially struck by two writers. One was William Faulkner, and the other was James Baldwin. And I also had a professor, Dr. Joanne Braxton, and it was really she was the one who sort of introduced me to the idea of possibly being a college professor. I'd never thought about that, and so it was from there and majoring in English, and then once I got to graduate school at first University of Kentucky and then University of North Carolina Chapel Hill, and my interest in African American literature just continued to blossom. And so I was introduced, more to more Baldwin. I was introduced to writers like Ann Petrie, whom I really didn't know much about. I was introduced to Ernest Gaines. Had heard of some of these writers, but at Chapel Hill, I had wonderful professors, and they just nurtured my interests. And so, it was, and especially James Baldwin's writings just really sort of struck a nerve with me, and just the way he wrote about, gender, the way he wrote about race, way he wrote about sexuality, and so I did, my doctoral dissertation on him and Ernest Gaines and August Wilson, and so those three writers, along with Ann Petrie, just have had a monumental effect on my personal and my intellectual life.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That was pretty inspirational from each and every one of those three authors that you mentioned. So if you had the ability to have dinner with any of the writers that you've written about, who would it be and what would you guys actually talk about?
Well, that's fascinating. I don't think I've ever been asked that question, so I gotta marinate on that a bit. Well, all of them are deceased, so I can't insult any of them by picking one over the other. But I guess I'd probably say first that what. So I should say actually I have met Ernest J. Gaines, is a writer who my last book was on, and I should also say let me do a quick plug here. So, the United Postal Service has issued a stamp in honor of Ernest J. Gaines. So I'm going to hold it up
Mhm.
here. I had the pleasure of serving as a consultant with United States Postal Service on the stamp, and so it was launched last month I'm sorry, earlier this month at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. And so I actually did have the pleasure of not just participating in that, but meeting and interviewing Ernest Gaines. And so, he is a writer that I actually knew, and I brought him to Mason a few years ago. So we have had dinner. So I guess in terms of the other writers, I think James Baldwin is an author who was so not just prolific and prodigious as a writer, but also prophetic in his keen understanding of American history and
Mm,
America's tortured racial history. And he grew up the child son of a preacher, and so once he became a writer, he sort of ascended to the pulpit, if you will, in terms of our national consciousness about America and about our history and about race and just the challenges that come with this really challenging topic. And so he delivered, you know, just really prophetic ideas about where we were going racially and what we needed to do racially, right? And so I think, having dinner with Baldwin, I probably wouldn't get a word in edgewise because he was very loquacious. I'll say that,
Mm,
but just in a profound kind of way. So I think, between his stunning intellect and his keen insights and his deep understanding of so many topics, history, race, gender, sexuality, literature, writing, the art of writing. A lot of people forget that Baldwin was a wonderful craftsperson in terms of his art. So I think dinner with Baldwin would offer just sort of an education. But I would also say, I guess the other writer in that sort of group is Ann Petrie. Now, and I don't know, have you ever heard of Ann Petrie, Jalen?
yes.
You had heard of her. How had
Yep.
you heard of her?
Through a history class that I've taken in in high school.
Oh, that's great. Okay. So
So, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
all
I'm
right,
sorry.
you go ahead. You go ahead.
No, no. That's pretty much it.
Okay. So I don't know if you were introduced. I know she wrote several books for young people, and one of her most popular was Tituba of Salem Village. She wrote a book about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Do you remember the
Mhm.
book that you encountered by her?
It might have been the Harriet Tubman one. I remember they had it on display. They did like
Okay.
a whole ceremony for her at my high school, and they had a few of the books that you mentioned, but it was definitely the Harriet Tubman one, and that one really touched me a
Oh,
bit.
I'm so delighted to hear that. She's a writer who should be more well known. And one of my former students, I give him a shout out here, Brian Matthews. He became a high school teacher, and he was instrumental in actually getting Ann Petrie's work on the AP exam. And so I was really
Hmm.
delighted that she was being introduced to younger people because she was a prolific writer. She was born
Yep.
in 1908 and she died, I believe, in 1992. And her, primary claim to fame was being the first African American woman writer to write a novel to sell 1 million copies, a book called The Street in 1945. And so I think if I had the opportunity to have met Ann Petrie, she was from Connecticut. We think about a lot of the major African American writers, and a lot of them are from the South. Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, Maya Angelou. Ann Petrie was from New England, and so she brought a sort of different sensibility. But she wrote, very penetratingly about any number of topics, not only race and class, but also about sexism. And so she introduced in the 40s. She really was instrumental in bringing the plight of African American women to the forefront. The protagonist of her novel, The Street, is a young black woman who's raising her son in Harlem, single mother, and it comes with several challenges. She's preyed upon by people from the outside community, by people from inside the community. And so I think Ann Petrie, I think she'd have a lot to teach us today. And so I would, and also Ann Petrie is just sort of I think of her as a kindred spirit. She seemed like, I never met her, but she just seemed like a very kind of reserved and quiet, but also
Hmm.
really forceful kind of person, in her own way. And so I think, I think of myself in that same way. So I think we would have hit it off as well. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's excellent. But I actually also wanted to touch a little bit more on you serving as a consultant for the Postal Service on their new stamp commemorating Ernest J. Gaines. I'm
Yes.
sorry, the light just went out.
Okay. Okay. There it is.
Commemorating on Ernest J. Gaines. Can you tell us a little bit more about this experience?
Sure. So I have to be honest, man. It was I got an email from somebody who had been he was I think maybe an artist, a graphic artist, I think, and I got an email. I guess this is about a year and a half ago from this guy, and I didn't know him, and he sent this email, and he said the United States Postal Service was in the process of considering. It had been approved, but considering a stamp honoring Ernest Gaines. Gaines died in think it was November 2019. And so when I got this email, it wasn't he didn't have his his email address wasn't USPS, so it was a personal email. So I was a little bit skeptical. I wasn't sure about it, but he said, I'm working with the United States Postal Service. Would you be interested? and serving as a consultant. And so, I sort of guardedly said yes. And then I didn't hear, so he said, fine, I'll be in touch with you. And then I didn't hear from him for a few months. And so I was, still, just kind of wondering. But then I finally did hear from him again. And by this point, he sent me a biocritical sketch that someone had written. I'm not sure if he wrote it or someone else. But anyway, he sent that and he said my job as a consultant would basically be to review this this biographical essay, this biocritical essay. I'm sorry, and correct any mistakes, add anything. So basically, my job as a consultant was to to carefully read it, and I did rewrite some sections of it. And so whenever you go online and see the stamp, you'll see a narrative that accompanies it. And so I was instrumental in helping to revise that narrative. So that was the extent of my participation in it. And lo and behold, so once it was approved, I got an email from the director of the Ernest J. Gaines Center. Ernest Gaines taught at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, and so they have on campus, they have an Ernest Gaines Center. And so I know the director of that center. I had gone there several years ago to deliver a keynote address on Ernest Gaines. And so she emailed me and she said, well, the Postal Service is having the launch here on our campus, thinking it was in January, I believe it was. And she asked me if I'd be interested in participating. And she said, there are going to be four speakers. You only get to talk for 5 minutes. So, you can see I'm kind of talkative. So, she was like, you gotta keep it brief. But
Hmm.
so I was one of four people honored to have to be invited to speak. And so it was a beautiful ceremony, and it was the launch of the stamp, and it was great because his widow, Diane Solney Gaines, she was there, and many members of his family, members of her family, officials from the Postal Service, and I'll be quite honest. I didn't know there were so many people interested in stamps. There had to be about 400 or 500 people at this event. And after the formal event, the stamp then went on sale for the first time, and so there were hundreds of people purchasing the stamp, and it was a wonderful event. I had no idea that it would be such a grand event, and my mother was able to attend, so that was very special for me as well. My mother had not really had the opportunity to attend many of my events like this. So it was really wonderful on many accounts. So yeah, that was how I was involved with the stamp launch.
That's extraordinary. Getting involved and really just putting yourself out there. Congratulations, by the way, on
Thank you.
being
Thank you.
making that top list. Now, if you were to create an essential reading list for Black History Month,
Yeah.
what books would be on that list?
Oh man, you got some great questions, Jalen. I wish you were English major. I'd love to have you in class. You sharp. You're sharp. Um, so I think most of my books would be literature related since that's my field. But I think first and foremost, I would say a foundational text for African American uh, studies, African American
Mhm.
history, African American literature, African American psychology, African American sociology, African American anthropology. I would say the foundational text would be W.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk, 1903. So I would, that would probably be at the top of the list. I also tell my students that I always repeat the professor who directed my doctoral dissertation. His name was J. Lee Green, and he used to say that any educated person, no matter what they are studying, no matter what their major in, any educated person has read a narrative of enslavement and liberation. So I always tell my students, especially the English majors, you should have read Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. You should have read Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So those books would also be sort of I would say those books would be the foundational books. They were published in the 19th century. So I would say, well, Du Bois actually early 20th century, but I would say those books would be foundational. And then, just the great writers, Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Are Watching God, Langston Hughes's the poem The Weary Blues. Um, Nella Larson's Passing. I think Passing has just been made into a film 2 or 3 years ago. Um, people often forget the history of African American drama, and so I would say a play like A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. You mentioned August Wilson earlier. August Wilson's Fences. Of course, Richard Wright is one of our, on the Mount Rushmore of African American writers. So, Black Boy or Native Son. Um, I in my African American literature class this semester. So this class starts from World War II to the present, and we actually started with Gwendolyn Brooks, who's known primarily as a poet, but she also wrote a novel. She wrote a beautiful lyrical coming of age novel from the perspective of a young black girl. And now, there's been a lot of interest in black girl and black girlhood studies as a field. And so I would say Gwendolyn Brooks's novel Martha. Some more contemporary writers, again, drama. I think drama is a genre that's overlooked, but we've got some wonderful African American women playwrights. Lynn Nottage is one. Susan Lloyd Parks is another. Katori Hall is another. So I would say, these writers would be at the top of my list. One of my favorite plays is a play called Top Dog Underdog by Susan Lloyd Parks, and someone told me that it's actually been revived on Broadway this year. So they're just, I could give you 100 titles, but I'll definitely email you a list with several more titles on it because I know I'm skipping something. But anyway, that I think that'd be a good place to start. And of course, James Arthur Baldwin, my literary godfather, I call Baldwin, and my favorite novel by him is a book called Another Country, but also his social criticism like The Fire Next Time, book he published in 1964. I would say that should be essential reading for right now. I would even say, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I would really appreciate having that list too. Last thing I wanted to wrap up with was, with your teaching interests, it includes Black literary masculinity studies,
Yeah.
um, the Black Bildungsroman,
Mhm.
and African American LGBT studies. If
Mhm.
members of our audience are also interested in these topics,
Mhm.
what courses exactly would you recommend, and how would you describe your own courses,
Yeah.
or your teaching style per se?
Yeah. Well, the English department here at George Mason has been great in letting me and my colleagues. So I have two other colleagues who teach African American literature. Dr. Stefan Wheelock, who's a specialist in early African American literature, so literature before the 20th century.
Mhm.
He's a specialist in that. He's done remarkable work. He's working right now. He's working on a project on the pioneering fearless journalist Ida B. Wells. So Dr. Wheelock teaches. Usually we have a sequence of African American literature courses. So I'll just give you the numbers. So English 348 and 349. Those are the two courses that focus on African American literature before the 20th century. And then we have English 350 and English 351, which so 350 is sort of 1900 to World War II, and then 351 is World War II to the present. So we've just hired a new professor, Dr. Stephanie Rambo, and her area of specialization is African American women writers and literature criticism and theory. So, so mainly I teach the 350 and 351, right? So those are the courses that deal with 20th and 21st century African American literature. And I'm kind of an old school professor. I've been here a minute. Oh, there goes the lights again. I'm an old school professor. I've been here a minute. So, my teaching style is, it's very discussion oriented. I remember William and Mary and I had a few professors, God bless them, older professors who just, read from notes, and you could imagine how boring that was. So I've always really vowed to be a professor. As you can see, I like to talk, but I try to make the class an exchange, because I feel like I learn from students too. And so I really try to,
Mhm.
not only, hear my students and give them a platform and an outlet to respond to the literature, but I also see my role as instrumental in helping them to develop their voice, right? So that's one dimension of my pedagogy. Another dimension of being an English professor, the importance of writing. and we live in such a technologically driven age where, it's all email and texting and TikToking. I don't, I'm not even quite sure what TikTok is, but anyway, it's a whole nother topic. And so, I think a lot of students don't appreciate the importance of writing and writing well. And so in my classes, you do a lot of writing and you get a lot of feedback from me. And, sometimes the feedback is not always cute. Sometimes the feedback is very direct, but it's all very constructive criticism because I try to tell students that no matter what your major is, if you're a business major, if you're an econ major, if you're a biology major, you still need to know how to write well. Whatever
Absolutely.
whatever walk, whatever you're going to pursue after you leave Mason, whether it be graduate school, whether it be the business world, whether it be professional school, you need to know how to communicate well. And there's no substitute for knowing how to write well, how to write clearly, how to write concisely, how to write lucidly. So in my classes, that not only do I stress, the ability to read the literature closely and carefully, but I also stress the importance of communicating clearly about it, how to construct a thesis, how to construct an argument, how to construct effective sentences, right? So anyway, that's just a little bit about my teaching. And you mentioned new course that I've developed last year is a course focusing on African American LGBTQ writers, and I taught that for the first time last spring, and it was really successful. The class was full. We had a lot of great students. I'm teaching the class again this semester. It's not as many students are taking it, but clearly there still is an audience for that. That the African American LGBTQ experience is one that people really haven't talked about in the field of African American literature, or at least not as much as it should be. And so I hope this course will sort of fill that gap and, talking about writers like, not just James Baldwin, but, Audre Lorde, the Alice Walker, LGBTQ writers who've been part of the tradition, Randall Keenan. We're reading a book right now in that class. I'll just hold it up. We just were discussing it yesterday. This is a book called Loving Her by a writer named Anne Allen Shockley. It was published in 1974, and it had the distinction of being, the first novel that dealt with a protagonist who was a openly black, same gender loving woman. And so, there's a tradition that people of this writing that people just don't know about, right? So anyway, I know again a long-winded answers, but that's a little bit about the courses I teach.
Oh, that's pretty cool. You were able to really nitpick different businesses about the importance of communication and having that in those businesses. Um, was there anything else you wanted to touch on today about, your experience at Mason or anything like that?
Well, I would just say, I've been here for this, next fall will be my 30th year here. And I'm really, yeah, I've been here a minute, man. Before you were long thought of, I've been teaching at Mason. I know. But one of the things that I'm delighted about is that, when I first started teaching here, students had really most students, if not all of them, had never encountered an African American writer, an African American writer. Forget more than one. Maybe they had, heard of a Langston Hughes, or maybe they had heard of, Raising the Sun, Lorraine Hansberry. But I would say in the ensuing years, my students are now, or Mason students generally, they've been exposed to some African American literature, in ways that even, when I was a student in high school and, even college, I wasn't exposed to much African American literature at all. And so I'm really delighted to see that, students are much better read. They're much better grounded in a tradition of African American literature that's part of, the larger American literature landscape, right? You can't talk about African American literature without talking about the dominant American literary canon, right? And so the great thing about now is that, we've broadened that canon, right? The canon used to be sort of exclusively, one race and one gender, but now, we've got Native American writers as a part of the American canon. You've got Asian American writers. You've got Latina writers. You've got LGBTQ writers. So you've got, and of course, African American literature, right? So you've got all of these traditions that are traditions in themselves, but they're a larger part of the American literary tradition, and that's something to be celebrated. That diversity of just tradition is something not to be dismissed and criticized, but it's something really to be celebrated. So I'm glad to be a part of that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Professor Clark. Love the idea of diversity and being able to celebrate what Mason has accomplished with that.
Well, thank you
And
for your great questions, Jalen. I really appreciate them.
oh, thank you. Thank you so much.